see how you need to sequence things out in a way that's not obvious. And so this could be someone here at the conference. Pick a buddy, exchange information. When you go back, talk to them about how you're building your resilience program. You can bring in an outside consultant. You can bring in, another person that you want to bring in. However you do that, bounce that off of somebody and get that benchmark and understand where you're at and how you can push harder. Or get more returns out of what you have today if you think you've hit the best level. That repeated exposure, we have to really practice the things that are common and are important to us and build that muscle memory and how we can respond. So again, with the plane, it was literally a heuristic that they developed. They could look out and see. They didn't have to do any calculations. They didn't have to do anything to know they weren't going to make the airport. Probably the fourth most important thing, because a lot of this probably sounds stressful and hard work and a lot to do. With building muscle memory and any good practice, you have to build in essentially rest and relaxation. So, you push a team to go do an exercise and go get better, and we've increased our times to respond or decreased our downtime or availability is up. And so what's the offset of that you give people a chance to essentially recover and respond? If you feel like you're constantly in crisis mode, which I know a lot of you do, given the size of your organization you may manage, or the size of your team, which may be just you, how do you balance that to the point where you really can come in with a strategic mindset for what you need to do and really look at it instead of coming in and fighting fires? It's a balance, right? So this is something that we have to shift. Last thing, most important, practice failure. So really interesting story on Amelia Earhart. Before she was really famous, she actually used to train pilots. And she would say that she would train every pilot to handle a stall when they got advanced enough. And the reason she did that, engines were less reliable back when she flew. But she said, if I don't train you how to handle a stall flying straight in sunny weather, when it happens in the dark, you're never going to recover. And so how many exercises in our organizations are we setting up where we're basically flying straight and we're doing an exercise and it's really not going to help us get better as a result of doing that? How do we practice so when it's in the worst case scenario, we know how we need to respond and how we need to pivot? We need to thread this in to what we do every day. And so I love this picture because if it gets to a point ultimately where you're able to stand on a mountain range and look out and see what's going on, clearly you're doing it right, I think. You have that rest and relaxation period, you're looking down on what you've helped build in your organization. But the most important thing of how to start is stop preparing for the last disaster that you experienced. Cyber, hacking, malware, it's hot. It's something that's impacting almost every organization. You can build as tall of a fortress as you want. You can build your walls as high as you want. You are not immune. Just because it happened to you before, does it make it more or less likely it's going to happen to you again? Depends on if you've, closed the door behind the people that walk through. But you're failing to prepare for things that might actually impact your organization. It's the shark and the plane crash availability heuristic theory. We can't focus on things that are memorable just because they're emotional, because we see them a lot in the media. We have to focus on what's actually going to impact our organization. You can do that through peer discussions. You can do that. You can subscribe to threat intelligence sources. There are publicly available. There are privately available threat intelligence sources. But how do you make sure that you understand what actually might impact your organization? And that's what you focus on, not the last thing that you recovered from. You go through a malware attack or cyber attack, yeah, your CIO or your CTO is going to walk in, or your board, and they're going to say, I never want to be on the news again for having a cyber attack or having a breach. Okay, we have other issues we need to solve as well. Let's not put all the money into one bucket. The other thing we have to do, again, this concept of increasing your ability to adapt. You have to figure out how you empower your teams to be malleable, to be able to understand the situation. And really, like my concept, my team's heard me say this over and over again, and it's probably drilled into their brain. We need to reduce the time from understanding an impact to responding to recovering. If you take those 3 points in time, and you figure out how you can shorten the cycles and put more information and more decisions, came in the form of heuristics on the Flight 1549, that's going to help you respond more quickly and hopefully mitigate the spread of that disaster, the ventilation system failing, and it starts to impact everything else. The other thing we have to do, it's this whole, fortress versus tents. Everyone in here, and I think this group probably would say we all accept that disasters are going to occur. Is there anyone here that thinks that they've completely protected their organization and nothing's going to happen to it? Okay, thank you for not raising your hand, anybody. You can't. You can't. You actually are pretty unlikely to even predict what's going to happen, but we can have informed decisions on what's likely given threat intelligence and past activities. We have to prepare for anything. We have to have backup systems for key systems. There's a great adage, the space shuttle, when it flew, and it took, I think, 25 years to actually get the first flight off the ground. Great book called Into the Black, written by the two astronauts that flew the first space shuttle. When they wrote the software for the space shuttle on IBM AP101s, they had one team write software, and they sent it to a completely different company and had them write the same software given the requirements. And so when the space shuttle flew, there were 5 computers on board at all times. 4 ran the primary operating system, and the 5th had the third-party operating system running that was on standby. The computers would cross-check themselves, and if one disagreed, they would essentially vote the other one out, the way the software was written. So if one said, you're pitched too high, and the other 3 said you're fine, the 3 would win. If it ever got to the point where they all essentially disagreed, the astronauts could actually take and pull the primary 4 out and put the 5th one in active mode. How do you think about that in your organization for critical systems? Because clearly at the space shuttle, they called it the flying brick. Literally, it was like the least aerodynamic plane, but it actually soared into the sky really well. So when they landed, it had all the aerodynamics of a brick landing through the atmosphere, coming down onto the runway. How would you do that without a computer? Really interesting, right? So how do we accept that? I'm going to wrap up with a quote here. Mike Rowe, I think, is a very interesting individual in the way he approaches things, and I love this. Whether you're right or whether you're wrong, isn't it fascinating how these days how certain we all sound? We don't know what's going to happen. We got to be able to account for things that we can't even consider are going to happen and have systems to help us deal with that. I want to see if we have any questions from the CVent system. If we have time, do we have time, or are we, okay. What kind of guidance would you provide to organizations that need a first step in attaining resilience? Love this. I am a crawl, walk, run kind of guy. And so if you try and do a lot, and you try and hit from good, better, best, the best part right away, it's not going to work. Focus on one principle of resilience through your organization first, or one kind of product that you're delivering or service externally, and figure out how you can make that resilient. That's going to help you build a couple different practices. I didn't say focus on one location. I didn't say focus on one business unit. Focus on something you're delivering externally or that's critical to an objective in your company. That's going to help you build resilience through multiple locations, through multiple teams, potentially to third-party vendors, and you're going to basically put a lot of practices in place that then can scale up a lot better. So just look at your company's objectives for this year, for next year, and figure out what really supports a lot of that, and take that, because that's important to leadership, and you can essentially build resiliency around that then scales through the organization. I think we have probably one more. When do you think regulators will put more enforcement, regulatory review around resilience? The UK, it's already happened. I think it's coming to the US pretty quickly. So the UK, I think, gave them, the organizations, the firms, until 2025 to really be able to show that they can be resilient, and there's metrics around this. For us, it's a mindset shift. It's a way we have to measure things in a way we haven't before. So to do that properly, everyone in here is going to be much more tied into the operations of your business than I think you may be today. And some of you are knit right into operations, but you're going to be in the day-to-day type of activities to be able to measure not when something's critical, but when things start to hit the yellow line on how we're going to understand that. And so it becomes much more of a measurement of things that could happen and could trend into a critical mode that we need to build systems around. I think it's coming here to the US pretty quickly. Do we have time for one more? Yeah, okay. How do you recommend we exercise going forward? I'm advocating for multiple scenarios for risks we're forecasting or never tested for. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thanks, Ashley. It's really interesting. So from an exercise perspective, and again, I know there's this mindset shift that we have to get our teams over, which is like, I have to incent people to come and want to do my exercises. I'm going to throw a pizza party. We're going to bring lunch in. I'm going to make it really fun. We're going to go do something. And so if I really think it's all about tying into corporate objectives and aligning to that and showing value as far as, again, kind of how you get started. I think the exercises you tag into that. How do I show that we've built resiliency for something that really matters to one of our key corporate objectives? If I do that, it's probably easier to engage senior leadership and the people that I need because they're measured on meeting those objectives. And so if I can backstop what they're trying to already accomplish so that they get their bonuses and they get the recognition, that's probably a good way to start. So how do we think about the risks that could impact and throw off, if you do SWOT, if your company does SWOT planning, anything, clearly there's more advanced versions of that. How do we think about the threats that could come in that would actually affect our key corporate objectives? Those are the threats we might exercise against. I think that's a good place to get started because then we can get that buy-in pretty quickly to really build resilience for what our leaders care about. I think I'm probably out of time, am I? Awesome. I do have on my slide, I don't know if we can throw that back up, my contact information. If you do have any questions, please feel free to connect. We'll be happy to connect on LinkedIn or at our booth at Infinite Blue. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Frank. His comments on financial resiliency and the conversation he had about Brock Long was really resonating. I heard Brock Long speak, I believe, earlier this year, and could also resonate with those comments. So thank you so much for the presentation today. If you have any comments or things that you would like to add in the survey, of course, the CVent app is available for you. Appreciation to Infinite Blue for being one of our platinum sponsors. And at this time, we'll let you out for a 15-minute break. We'll be back at 10:45. right, welcome back. And a virtual hello to all of you that are online. It's great to see you. I just had somebody come up and say that some of you are asking questions and tuning in virtually, so thank you guys for tuning in from all around the world. So we're gonna go ahead and prepare for our panel. So as you guys are in the lobby, please make your way in. I'll try to prolong this just a little bit so you make sure you hear the intro in this awesome panel. So supply chain logistics are often fragile, complex, and endlessly interconnected. Major ports that used to work like clockwork have been overrun with container ships queuing for days. The congestion can extend through every facet of transportation with skyrocketing costs, a shortage of truck drivers, and much more. This new reality is forcing organizations to adopt new strategies and technology to keep goods moving. Today's panel will discuss why getting ahead of disruptions is more important than ever. Please help me welcome Damian Walch, one of our moderators for today's panel. Damian is a managing director with Deloitte, and he leads their crisis and resilience practice in the United States. Please give a warm welcome. Thank you, sir.
Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? I like it. They're already, hey, David, how are you? Nice to see you. All right, we've got a great panel today. First person I'm going to invite up is Michele Turner. Most of you know Michele is a best-selling author of short stories of continuity and resilience. I love the fact that you wrote a book. That's awesome.
Thank you.
2022 DRI Lifetime Achievement Award winner. I think I should have introduced you guys first because you're not going to be able to. Sorry. Lot of experience in the industry, but she is currently the Global Deputy Chief Continuity and Resiliency Officer at Expedia. So, Michele Turner. Can you guys hold your applause? They're all great.
Don't make them hold their applause. They can applaud if they want to.
Tony, come on up. Tony Pelli is our next speaker, or our next panel member. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you.
Tony's the practice director for security and resilience for the BSI group. He has, this is pretty wild, there's some big numbers here. He has assessed more than 50 billion in trade in a wide range of industries and designed and implemented risk management measures for clients in more than 20 countries. Assisted with the design and implementation of supply chain risk management plans, policies, procedures, which is what we're going to talk about today, a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So again, Tony Pelli.
Thank you.
I knew you felt bad that she got a lot of applause, so that's why.
I know, thank you. Yeah, building me up here, there you go.
And lastly, Erik Hanson. And Erik is a manager of disaster recovery for British Columbia Ferry Services. He's an ICS and Incident Command System 300 practitioner and an active member of BSI Canada. Now, here's the crazy stuff. He helps manage resilience for one of the largest ferry operators in the world, serving more than 60,000 customers, 23,000 vehicles across 30 terminals on a daily basis. And before you applaud again, I want to just see if your mic's working. Give us a couple of those numbers about just the organization.
Sure. So our shortest route is about an hour and a half. In the peak season, we run that every hour from about 6 a.m. to about midnight. That's our shortest route. The longest route runs over 24 hours from the tip of the island of Vancouver Island all the way up to the south of the Alaska border. We also have food operations, hotel operations, commercial services. We do commercial traffic, and then some of the smaller islands are only serviced by us. So if we aren't running, they don't have food, groceries, gas, mail.
So so give it up for Erik. So I wanted to do that. Just you've got a plethora of experience up here, so really take advantage of it. I would encourage anybody as we go through the questions, ask additional questions. You use the CNET app, and we'll have a great session. So, all right. With that, let's get started. So my first question is. Oftentimes, we use the term supply chain resilience, third-party risk management, vendor risk management. We use those terms very fluidly. It's kind of like resilience, business continuity, disaster recovery. Sometimes we get caught up in the taxonomy or we don't think about it. So my first question is, are these phrases the same? Supply chain risk, supply chain resilience, vendor risk management, third party. Are they the same? Are they mutually exclusive? That's my first. So Tony, I'm going to flip that to you.
Sure, yeah, I think they're interconnected. They're slightly different, but interconnected, and I think it also depends on who you're talking to and about what. I think we discussed initially, it's kind of like sustainability. It means all things to all people. But I do think that, yeah, supply chain risk management is a bit different than third-party risk management, a bit different than vendor risk management, but they're definitely linked. I think if you're looking at it from a procurement angle, you're thinking more about vendor risk management. If you're somebody like Michele, for example, you may be thinking more about pure supply chain risk management. And then if you're in IT, you may be looking at third-party risk management. But I think all of those groups need to work together to ensure that their supply chains, are not disrupted. Because there's IT systems that link in with your suppliers. There is parts of onboarding and procurement where you need to be looking at business continuity and resilience, even if it's not your direct responsibility for the supply chain. So I think there are related terms, related functions, and related processes, but everybody needs to have at least some understanding of what that looks like for your organization. So defining what is your supply chain, who's responsible for each part of it, and during the sort of vendor or partner life cycle, who's responsible for the different parts of that as well, from procurement through to onboarding, management, and then offboarding as well.
So Tony, can I say, don't get caught up in the terminology?
Absolutely,
Okay.
Yeah. I think think in terms of outcomes and think in terms of risk, which is where we always start with our clients is. I was telling Erik this. I was like, a lot of people don't even know where their supply chains are or what they are, really. They understand that there's vendors who are doing things for them, but they don't understand how critical those are to their business. They don't understand, even in some cases, where they're located or what they're doing, especially when it comes to transportation and logistics. So think in terms of outcomes and think in terms of risk. What are you trying to avoid? What is the cost of those disruptions, and then sort of work your way back from there to the functions that need to be involved in managing those risks.
Excellent. Erik, I'm gonna flip it to you in that regard because it just seems to tee up so much of what you said. Anything you would add to that from what your organization does?
I wouldn't change a lot from what Tony said. We agree with it. Whether you're looking at an IT vendor, supplier, or ship parts, it doesn't matter. We're looking at the outcomes and what are those. I think the caveat that we try to avoid is we don't need to assess every vendor. Find the ones that are important, find the ones that are going to stop, for us, from sailing.
That is really critical, I think. Don't try to assess every vendor. I think that's where a lot of companies start. They say, well, we need to manage risk in our supply chains. Well, what are we going to do? We're going to audit. Okay, who are you going to audit? We're going to audit everybody. And it's like, well, in supply chain, that could be hundreds or thousands of organizations, and that's just not feasible. So there needs to be some understanding of the risk up front to help with criticality. And we always say in supply chain that 20% of your suppliers are going to cause 80% of your problems. So find and focus on that 20% and take it from there.
Could you also, and Michele, I'm gonna hit you with the next question. Could you also say focus on the most critical business services or processes, and then determine if there's third parties, there's suppliers that are critical to those services or processes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a lot of organizations there's a poor understanding of sort of what has been outsourced or what's reliant on outside vendors and supply chain partners. I mean, in a lot of cases, the companies that we work with in like electronics or retail industry, it's pretty straightforward, right? The factories make our stuff, somebody else transports it. But in other industries, and I feel like Michele probably has quite a bit of experience here, it's not quite as straightforward. So I think it's important to sort that out.
All right, I'm going to flip to the next question.
Actually, you know what? Yeah, I have something to say on that one. So I acknowledge that we don't need to get caught up in the terms, but I think we need to respect the terms, meaning there is a difference between risk and resilience, in my humble opinion.
I agree, yeah.
We need to understand our risks, and through understanding our risk, we understand, well, what do I need to put in place to ensure that these risks can be mitigated and to ensure that if something were to happen, I'm able to bounce forward and not bounce back. I want to make sure that there's something there that's a jumping off point for me. And to your point on critical services, we definitely want to make sure that we understand, well, which ones are critical, because you can't boil the ocean. But the way I put it is that you take a look at the whole ocean to determine what you need to whittle down to the critical few. But you have to acknowledge everything that's there, or else you're not going to be able to really drill down to the critical few. So.
And so, Michele, you just screwed up my second question.
Apologies.
So you said you need to think about the risks, and risks are different than resilience. Could I paraphrase that a little bit and say you need to think about the potential disruption scenarios that your organization is exposed to?
Most definitely.
Okay.
Because risk is all about understanding, you start at the top of the house with threat. What's the threat? What's the susceptibility of that particular threat should that occur? And then specifically, what's the risk to my business if all of that were to happen? And now resilience says, let's acknowledge all of that to make sure that we can put things in place to be able to get over that hump if it were to happen again. I don't have to still be in that pothole. I can actually go right over that pothole and go on to something else.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right, now I'll hit you with my second question.
All right.
So supply chain, right? We've talked a little bit about physical products, right? So is this applicable to certain industries, consumer products, retail, industrial products, logistics? Or is this applicable to technology companies or financial services companies? It seems, some organizations, it's not that obvious how supply chain relates to those organizations.
You know what? Supply chain is supply chain. It's there. Whether you recognize it or not, it's there. And so it's a matter of really taking the time to understand, well, what are my critical services? And let me go backwards, work back to be able to identify, well, how do I get this in place? And who's involved? And what are the dependencies? So it's there regardless. You're not going to get away from supply chain, whether you're small, medium, big business, it's there.
Gotcha. So really looking at, again, we talked about business services, looking at that end-to-end business service and saying, what are the things, what are the components that are critical to restore that in the event of a disruption?
That's exactly right. And a lot of mistakes that I see organizations making, they'll identify it, but they don't really bring the vendor to the table to partner on exactly why this is critical. Yes, we have a critical project. You are a part of this, and we need you at this time for this reason. They don't really engage them in that way as a partner. So I think that there's an opportunity there for us to really get real about what our vendors are assisting with, how critical they are, and make sure that they understand that, look, we're looking at you to help with this.
So I'm gonna hit you. I'm gonna hit you.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you.
I was just, I very much agree with that. Yeah.
So Michele just said something like have the vendors assist with, right? So that has a connotation of a discussion, a collaboration with
There
vendors.
has to be. They have to be engaged. I mean, if you are managing this critical effort for my critical process, you better believe I'm going to have some conversations with you. I don't want you to know that this is that critical to me at the last minute.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I see Tony over here like shaking his head like a great. So I'm gonna flip that. I'm gonna say, oh, so that's collaboration, that's discussion. But, you know, look, I work for, I'm a consultant, but I work for a really big audit firm, right? And personally, I see a lot of organizations auditing third parties, auditing critical vendors. And doing so even with SOC 2 reporting or questionnaires. That's not collaboration and that's not discussion. So sing a few bars on that.
Well, I just want to say, I think, Michele, it is not possible for me to agree with you more, I guess. And, you know, we do see that the first impulse for a lot of people is, well, this is a critical supplier, so let's audit them, right? But an audit is a point in time. It's something you're doing maybe once a year. I do think that, you know, people need to start thinking about risk and resilience as part of their normal conversations with suppliers. So, you know, don't just talk about quality, don't talk about on-time delivery, you know, the operations piece of it. Make sure that you're at least talking about risk and how they're managing risk as part of that conversation as well. And I think there's two sides to risk as well, right? So risk can have downsides, but there can be upsides to risk as well. And you can only really unlock those upsides if you are building collaboratively with your supply chain partners. And I think we saw that during a lot of the shutdowns that we saw in China at the beginning of this year. There were some companies that were able to, because they had trusted supply chain partners, they were able to begin quickly manufacturing in places like Vietnam or India or Mexico in a way that the companies that had more transactional relationships with their suppliers couldn't. So that's taking advantage of sort of the upside of risk there as well, and that can only happen through regular collaboration.
I'm going to come back. So Erik, go for it, Erik. I'm sorry.
I just want to build on what Michele and Tony have said. I agree with that. I think the piece of the collaboration that happens that you don't get in an audit and you don't get in a survey is understanding where your company is in the pecking order. So if I've got a critical vendor, am I third or am I 30th?
Very good point.
Right, and you do that through discussions, right?
Yeah.
And you know, again, I hear this all the time, right? SOC 2 reports, questionnaires, surveys, and we put it in the contract. You don't figure that stuff out from the contract, right? So excellent point. All right, I'm going to hit you with another one, Erik. So when we discuss supply chain resilience, what specifically should organizations expect resilience professionals can and should do to positively affect the gaps in disruptions? What should they do to affect those strategies?
I think it comes back to that collaboration piece. You have to be at the table. Your auditors should be your friends. Your supply chain people should be your friends, and build that network and have those open discussions and be frank that we've identified this critical vendor. If they go out of business, we need to do something. And if they're the only person that can deliver this widget or service, then we need to figure out how to fix that gap.
I'm going to keep going with that. How do you work with procurement or purchasing to do that? Isn't that what they're supposed to do? Would they get bent out of shape if a resilience professional does that?
I've made friends with our procurement department. And so when there's a procurement discussion, I'm at that table, I'm in those discussions. If it's a technology service, there's an entire process that needs to be adhered to. It's in the policies that I'm at the stakeholder table, not to cause roadblocks, but to prevent disruption.
Excellent, okay. We got a question from the audience, which a wonderful little opportunity to say, continue to send in your questions. If you haven't, I'm going to start calling people if you don't send in calling on people. You guys are stuck right here. So we got a question from Shane, and I'm going to ask the panel, whoever wants to grab it, how would you approach legacy suppliers that have contracts that are challenging to change or modify to address business continuity or business resilience vulnerabilities?
The first thing that I would do is just acknowledge that we are an environment that is ever evolving. And so if you have negotiated something 10, 15 years ago, you know good and well that there are some changes that need to be identified that will benefit not only your organization, but their organization as well. So it gets back to the partnering piece to say, you know what, it's been a while since we've had this contract in place. We really haven't taken a look at what the changes have been in the environment on either side. Let's sit down and take a look at this just to make sure that we have the right SLAs in place, or the RTO that was discussed is the right RTO that needs to be included. But it's really providing that open and honest piece. Now, I know that there are going to be some challenges. Not everything is unicorns and bunnies, but you have to at least start that conversation. And it's about evolution. You are not the same as you were 10, 15 years ago. And I think anybody would acknowledge that, and they'd be open to the discussion.
That's great. Where's Shane? Shane, thank you for the question. Yeah, it's an excellent point. And again, I will say I see a lot of organizations starting with SLAs, SLOs, contractual obligations. It's probably not a good place to start, right? That's not a great place to start a conversation. You said, honest discussion. Like it's a discussion. Let's start there with what do you think what are your expectations on what you're going to deliver to us versus the contract says this, right? That's not a great place to start.
And that's where the terms come in, the importance of respecting the terms. Because what you'll find is that you'll get in these conversations and you'll be saying one thing and you're using a word that triggers them to be thinking about something else when you're actually talking about the same thing 9 times out of 10. But just the words are a little bit different and the way that you look at them are different. So really starting that conversation to say, okay, this is what I'm looking at. This is what this word or term means to me. Are we on the same page there? Let's just start with a level playing field to make sure that everybody's on the same page and then move forward.
That's wonderful. Tony, I'm gonna flip that a little bit and ask, you alluded to earlier shutdowns in China. We saw that recently from a COVID perspective. There were some heat challenges in China that shut down plants across the certain regions. Is it realistic to think that a plan or a document, a business continuity plan, can help you with port closures or chip shortages or delays in raw materials? Does a plan tell you what to do?
Usually no. I think it can help, but I wouldn't say, okay, we've written our plan, we're done, we're good. I think it's an understanding of, in supply chain, there needs to be a bit more in order to build true resilience than just sort of writing the plan, testing the plan, that kind of thing, your sort of traditional business continuity planning. I think it's thinking about redundancy in your supply chain. It's thinking about stockpiling raw materials potentially, or increasing your sort of buffer times in the supply chain as well. So it's thinking about the plan, but then also thinking a bit bigger as well, that you may have to, overnight essentially shift your supply chain, as a lot of people saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we're fielding similar questions from clients as well, is that, well, we have a plan, but we realize that the plan isn't sufficient. And we need to go sort of, beyond that, and how do we plan for that? And so thinking about alternate suppliers, redundancy, building out more and better relationships, especially in the transportation and logistics areas, to help overcome some of those difficulties, I think is important.
That's awesome. Erik, I'm going to keep pushing on that. So a plan doesn't tell you that. Tony threw out the phrase, I always mess with people, true resilience, right? It sounds like it's about decision making. Really making decisions when events occur, when disruptions occur. You seem to be really in the eye of the storm, so to speak. Talk to the audience a little bit about that.
Yeah, so for us, people are the biggest supply chain problem right now for us. For lack of, we have ships, we have food, we have fuel, people. And the people we do have are really smart. So we take these plans and we work through these incidents and we build them up. No plan's gonna be perfect, but we just keep evolutionizing them, keep bringing them forward. And really the people know what to do. It's really making sure that it's there for the next generation and something truly catastrophic happens.
So so using a plan, using a playbook as a guide, and using that opportunity to coach or have discussions with your professionals about what strategies they'd employ.
Exactly.
Okay, all right. All right, we've got another question from Vanessa. And called you out, Tony. What are the top 3 blind spots you've seen as an outcome of your supply chain risk assessments?
Yeah, so one of the biggest ones we see is transportation and logistics. Obviously, that's for companies that are manufacturing things. They spend a lot of time working with the factories, working with the raw material suppliers, but they spend less time thinking about transportation and logistics. And I think largely because transportation's been very cheap and relatively easy to come by over the past 10 years or so, and that's not the case anymore. So that's one thing that we see is, you know, somebody can make your stuff, but how are they going to get it to your customers? And that's been a big issue. I actually think labor is another one as well that often gets overlooked. Is, well, what would we do if we couldn't have the workforce that we have now? And I think one of my biggest sort of big picture messages to people is that the holiday is over in a way for supply chains and extended international supply chains. Is that labor was cheap, money was cheap because interest rates were low, transportation was cheap. There was relatively few sort of geopolitical issues that you had to think about, and that's all changing now. So things that you took for granted, like labor or a stable geopolitical environment, you have to start thinking about a lot more now. So I guess going from largest or smallest bore to sort of biggest picture, transportation costs, and continuity in transportation and logistics, including warehousing and things like that, labor, and then the geopolitical environment and overall sort of political environment, I think, are the three things that are most often missed.
It's, excellent. Michele, I'm going to flip this to you and say, so Tony just alluded to the fact that, I can't remember, but the vacation's over, right? Interest rate climate or interest rate situation, potentially a challenging economic, definitely global economic climate, a challenging U.S. Financial climate, interest rates increasing. This group of professionals has to be more efficient with their dollar also, right? We can't just spend a bunch of money. What about that angle is you can't have redundant supply chains, redundant suppliers. How does efficiency come into play here, or managing that on a budget, so to speak?
So the first thing I think about is, what did the risk assessment tell you? Meaning, if the risk assessment said that the loss of this particular sole source supplier, the only supplier in town, the loss of that is going to cost you X billion or X million or whatever, well, take a look at that in alignment with what your organizational budget and other things are. And so if you know that the loss of that will cause a significant impact across the board, have reverberating wavelengths, exactly. Make sure that that's acknowledged. Go back to the risk assessment, understand what the impact is. Too many times we make these decisions to say, well, you know, we can't spend this money because of X reason. But don't give me that. Go back to facts and data. Go back to help me understand, well, why do I have to have this in place, and what is the impact? Should I have a sole source supplier, or maybe I should have a single source supplier that I like to do a lot of business with, but I've got another one in the back pocket that is geographically diverse, that won't potentially be impacted by the same types of business interruptions or disasters that others may be impacted by. So there's a lot wrapped in that, but hopefully I've answered your question.
There is. You've answered my question. I'm going to take it. I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. So what you said in a couple different questions is, think about your disruption scenarios, right? Your risks. Think about your criticality. Bring them together. Can you achieve the appropriate recovery objectives? You talked about RTOs earlier, right? So risk disruption scenarios, criticality of business services, bring them together. Can we address these recovery objectives? And if not, focus on the data and work with executives, work with people to say, what do we have to invest in order to mitigate those risks? What do we have to invest in order to address the disruption scenarios? And by the way, if you don't want to invest, okay, I'm just here to help you with that discussion.
This is a strategic conversation. This is not a tactical deal. This is strategic. And so you need to make sure, hey, has that RTO changed? Oh, this isn't something that you're wanting to invest in right now? Well, I'll tell you, if we don't invest that, the RTO is going to have to shift because we're not going to be able to do everything we said we needed to do. So let's talk about prioritization. But again, this is strategic. This isn't tactical.
So that's a really key message for all of you. Is it is a strategic conversation. You don't take the responsibility on yourself. What you're doing is you're facilitating that discussion, and you're engaging with executives, board members, leaders to say, this is the business decision that you have to make around this supply chain, around this
Exactly
supplier.
right. Gone are the days when we were business recovery coordinators and we were just taking pages and trying to understand who was on the team and how do you do vendor assessment. Gone are the days when it's just tactical and we're sitting at a desk flipping through papers. This is a strategic game. I forget the name of the movie, but the quote was, "This is chess, not checkers." So we need to make sure that we are strategic in this and what we do, and our organizations depend on that. We've got to be able to tie what we're doing in to the top of the house in the business strategy. I got a little passion there.
I love it. I love it. And so I'm going to keep going with that. And where's Jenny? Jenny, boy, all the questions are coming from the back. I love it. All you knuckleheads in the front, nobody's asking questions. Thanks, Jenny. So how do you deal, right? So this is chess. This is a strategic discussion. How do you deal with a single source vendor or single source vendors who are too big to fail and refuse to take commitments? They refuse to adapt. And I'll actually give an example. And Erik, I'm going to come back to you with this one. I'll start with you. But an example that comes up in financial services all the time are things like clearing and settlement organizations, that there are only a handful of them, custodians in some cases, that you don't have a lot of options. So when you say, hey, what is your recovery strategy? If you were to have a problem, how do you, I'll stop short of, well, how do you ensure continuity in my service? Their response, their typical response is, we've got 30 companies just like you, stand in line, get in line, right? Back to the prioritization. So, Erik, how do you deal with that situation?
Well, it really depends for us what we're talking about for single source. So if we're talking about an engine, our solution is we have an extra engine. We have a warehousing department. Anything that is mission critical to us, we have one. We can basically build a ship tomorrow, essentially. Same with foods. If it's a service like a clearing provider, I think that's where that relationship comes into play, understanding where you are. And if they really don't want to play, I'm going to go back to my relationship thing. I'm friends with legal. And if we're not adhering to the terms and conditions that are set forth, I give it back to legal and say, we're not meeting these. Do we want to accept this risk, or do we need to change something?
Okay. So you talk about building an engine or building a boat. Do you actually talk through those things with them? Would you sit down, and I'll take you out of your role for your organization, but would you suggest people work with other parts of their organization? Say, what would your strategy be if this service provider was unavailable? Would you go down that path?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I would sit down with the vendor, and I have sat down with vendors and openly said, show me your business continuity plan. You can blank out whatever you need to blank out, but I want to see the plan.
Okay. And Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, just really quickly on that, something that Michele said really resonated with me is taking it from that tactical conversation to a strategic level. So I think one thing that's been important, even for me in my career, but I assume for everybody else in their careers, is really think about how big is your team. And it's not just your direct reports, it's not just your boss, it has to involve legal, it has to involve procurement, it has to involve people who manage those supply chain relationships. And so you can sort of bring the weight of the entire company more than just sort of, hey, I'm the person who's doing business continuity planning. So building those kind of strategic relationships internally, so then you can bring them to bear if needed on suppliers as well.
And so you see, everybody sees the question that just came up about prioritizing suppliers, not getting into or getting out of analysis paralysis. Do you do that through, and I'll throw a couple items out for anybody, do you do that by looking at the most critical business processes or services? Do you say, let that drive the focus? Do you try to get some, we oftentimes try to talk with organizations about getting quick wins and generating momentum, but how do you get out of that analysis paralysis and prioritization of vendors? Go ahead, Erik.
I'll jump in. For us, we use the standard BI everybody uses, finance, legal, reputation, all that stuff. But we have one metric that is unique to us, and it's our crown jewel, and that drives all the business decisions. And that metric is, does this impact the ability to sail? Because at the end of the day, if the vessel doesn't move, we have a problem. I don't care if we're losing money. I don't care if we have a reputational issue. If the vessel doesn't move, that's what's important to us.
So, Erik, so important what you just said, right? If you look at, and most of us now have seen the term operational resilience, right, being driven out of the UK, DORA being driven out of EMEA, so important. And one of the core things in that operational resilience is understanding your critical business services, your crown jewels, right? What are the things that build your brand and reputation? And that's the best place to start. So that's probably the easiest way to get out of analysis paralysis. Getting executives in the room, getting, in some respects, board members in a room and saying, if we can only do 3 or 4 things, what are the 3 or 4 things that we do, and what's critical based on that? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, and it's making sure that you have those seats at the table to be able to have that, whether it's a quarterly operational risk discussion that you have, or some sort of engagement with senior leadership on a regular basis. What do you have in place to make sure that they understand that this is a program, this isn't a project? Projects have beginning and ends. This is a program, continuous improvement. It's the gift that keeps on giving. So how do you make sure that they are engaged at that level as necessary? And when you go to them, you got to make sure that you're going to them with those strategic things that tie to the mission and the vision of the organization, so that they know that, yeah, this is a strategic level.
And I think as well, highlighting those wins when they do occur, right? So just to emphasize that it's, it's not just, it's not just a cost, it's not a project, it's something we want to make ongoing and sustainable, that we're constantly adjusting as the environment adjusts, and then sharing. I mean, even if you have to be, hey, this happened to our biggest competitor, it did not happen to us for X, Y, and Z reason, basically. And that, I feel like there's more and more opportunities, especially with, ransomware and all that kind of stuff, to really highlight things like that in those quarterly meetings or monthly meetings or however often they take place.
And, we've all been doing this so long. So many of us have been doing this a long time. You talked about wins, right? You talked about a positive. Too often we fall back on fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? Oh my gosh, there's ransomware attacks everywhere. Look at the Colonial Pipeline. Look at this disaster. You've got to talk about how you've impacted that, how you've improved resilience versus just trying to scare the hell out of people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, even if at the start you have to scare the hell out of people to make them sit up and kind of take it seriously, you have to move to a position where, I think, Michele, you speak to this, in a fantastic way, that it's a program, it's going to mature, it's going to, generate positive externalities for the business, because you can scare people and want them to prevent the bad thing, but you really want them to buy into the program, which means driving wins and driving value for the organization as a whole. And that's where we typically see that the most successful programs are doing that. They're both providing value to the organization as a whole, making their supply chains work more efficiently, more effectively, and then highlighting that to the rest of the business as well.
I'm going to take what you just said, and I'm going to ask both Erik and Michele this question. So that you talked about that quick win. Erik, and I'm putting you on the spot, I apologize for this. Does your executive management team, does your board, do your leaders in your organization have confidence in your resilience program?
Short answer, yes. And the reason that is, I'm slightly reading ahead on the next question, it's my...
Don't read ahead.
They've purposely made my position an empowered role. So I report to the C-suite and to the board directly. So I have a dashboard, they can see what's going on, what's happening in the program, what are the roadblocks, and they can understand what's happening day in and day out. And they can ask me open-ended questions like, so why aren't we where we want to be? The other part is I have the power to stop anything in the company. I can stop procurement of any project if needed, if we're not meeting those business continuity objectives. So you can be sure everyone wants to be my friend.
Michele, how about you? Confidence in your program. Does your board, and this doesn't go, whatever we say in this room stays in this room.
And on YouTube, too.
And on YouTube.
We're not recording this, thank goodness. All right.
So here's the deal. I will not say anything specifically about my organization. However, what I will say is that I was hired to focus on resilience. Resilience being continuity management, business continuity and systems continuity, risk mitigation, which includes contractual obligations, as well as crisis management. So I was hired to do that. I do have the opportunity to speak to our C-level and senior leadership. And so I don't want to talk specifically about the organization, but the fact that I am there and I am making changes and I have a great team, one of the people on my team is over there, Pelli, that tells me something. It tells me something because you've got to pay attention. Are they just paying lip service? Did they get in trouble for something and that's why they hired you? I mean, there's all types of homework that you need to do. The other thing I wanted to say, though, and it speaks directly to what you called out, Tony, I did an article with Tony Scott. Tony Scott used to be the CIO of Microsoft, and we were talking, this was years ago, and we were talking about that fear piece, and he says, you know what, don't come to me as a senior leader in the organization, as the chief information officer, don't come to me with fear, like, oh, well, you know what, everybody's just gonna get shackled in jail if you don't do this. Come to me with facts and data on how things align to the business. Tell me based on an impact in this area, it's going to impact the business strategy in this way. that will not allow us to service our customers, or that will potentially impact our travelers, or things of that nature. Don't come to me with the fear, because that's about reaction. It's not response. Reaction is emotional, response is procedural, and that's how we need to roll.
Michele and I both grew up in Chicago, like on opposite, virtually on the same street, like opposite
Almost,
sides of the city. The Chicago just came out of Michele.
Did I lean in on that?
The number of times that I say, here's the deal, I say it all the time. Look, here's the deal, right?
Yeah.
But I do it in, you've lost that nasally Chicago
Have I?
accent. I still have it, so.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to go to our question, right? So we've talked about all these strategies and collaboration and bringing together all that good stuff, and with the best of intentions, we do this. We focus on our crown jewels, right? We focus on the critical business services, and we still have a vendor, maybe a legacy vendor, right, that we talked about before, that refuses to include disaster recovery or business continuity language in the contract. They have provided assurances through a vendor questionnaire. We talked about questionnaires. That they have a program, but they don't put any language in the contract for accountability, right? They trust us, they have it. If they, trust us, we'll do it, but we can't put it in the contract. Well, what the hell do you do then? Go ahead, Tony. I got it. We got a head shake from Erik too. So go you start.
I was like, I'm sure all of us have a lot, like firsthand experience with this, but I think the question itself, I mean, a vendor questionnaire, like we mentioned, that's a point in time, and there's, I think, ways to build accountability that don't require purely just the contractual terms, right? It's getting more frequent touches with that vendor. It's having those conversations, and Michele, you mentioned, moving beyond the emotional piece, but I do think that in some ways that can be helpful, right? Like, you want this vendor to feel bad if they let you down, and so if you build that relationship with them, and ask questions around the things that you've asked about in your vendor questionnaire as part of your reviews with them, I mean, that can be helpful, and that develops, not legal accountability, but it can develop that sort of relationship with the supplier where it goes beyond sort of that, just the transaction or filling out the vendor questionnaire. So it's tough, but I think that's where it starts.
And Erik, I'm going to hit you next. So I want to just comment on something. So obviously I work for a consulting organization, and I have clients that I've built relationships with, and we've screwed up. We haven't done things. But when that client that I have a relationship with, and I'm emphasizing that, there's a couple of you here, right? That I've known for years. But when they call and say, "Dude, like this isn't typically what you do," it feels something. It hurts, right? And that's really what you want. Like, they have something to, like, it's personal.
Yeah. I mean, at a minimum, you want them to pick up the phone because they recognize the name, but
right.
You can build to that. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. That is exactly what I mean.
Erik.
So there's a few different ways to approach this. The first is you can just be the roadblock, and sometimes legal will help you with that. And sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. If it doesn't work and they still want to proceed with the vendor, then I would look at exploring other ways to get that assurance without having it in the language that they think it's in. So don't make it a business continuity. Make it now they need to do a recovery exercise every 6 months. Why? Well, that's part of our processes. And just build it in other ways. It doesn't have to be this big block of legal text saying you must do this. You can just build into the processes and the procedures and have that relationship. The other one I would say, and Tony and I were talking about this earlier, I would get familiar with your state laws, because where I'm from, there are ridiculous laws around data security and business continuity, and use those to be your friend. Say, it's not me, this law says I have to do this.
So even in that phrase, you're using, I always say, and maybe this is my history, right, my experience is, use a carrot versus a stick. I alluded to it before, don't start with a contract. Don't start with obligations. start with a discussion and go from there. But if you have to, then you go to obligations, go to laws. But you're trying to have that, again, we go back to strategy, collaboration, right? It's the same kinds of things. So,
And I think there's a difference between relationship management and building that relationship and the emotional piece that I was talking about before. Because even when you're developing that relationship, it's based on the facts and data that you're working together with. So as long as you're still able to be grounded in that and build that relationship, I think that's the way to go. Yeah.
excellent, excellent. I'm gonna hit my question before I hit this next question. By the way, we've got about 7 minutes left, so just to keep everybody honest. Where's Zach? Zachary, sorry. Where's Zachary? Zachary, another person in the back. Thank you very much for the question. Okay. I'm going to go, Michele, I'm going to hit you with this one. So, again, we talked about disruption scenarios and we talked about criticality. Part of what we see organizations doing is scenario planning, discussing disruption scenarios, risks and threats, right? So you think through those disruption scenarios that could negatively impact the organization, and then working with supply chain vendors, organizations to discuss those strategies. Is that what we're really talking about? It's that collaboration, it's thinking about disruption scenarios, strategies that are employed. Erik alluded to before, like what activities would be performed. That's ultimately what we're doing.
Right, and we're speaking to this
No,
question.
I'm just broadly. I'm trying to like put a little ribbon on a lot of these discussions that we've talked about.
Yeah, it's definitely about collaboration. And if we go back to the previous question where we asked, well, what do you do if the vendor just doesn't want to play ball? Well, number one, go back to your relationship management, go back to the procedures, try to take the emotion out of it. But look, if there are things that you have to have, and for whatever reason the vendor is not able to provide it, then ask yourself if that's the right vendor, but also make sure that you check yourself to say, wait a minute, let me take a step back. Are you giving me what I need at the core, at the root of it? Are you giving me what I need, but you're using a different word? Again, go back to the terms. I've been in situations where it seemed like we might have been having a contentious conversation. We just stopped and said, wait a minute, are you asking for X that would align to the SLA? Well, yeah. Well, okay, then let's put that wording in the contract. That's what we're really talking about. All these other bougie foo-foo type of words that you're trying to use, let's just get down to brass tacks. So sometimes it's really just about taking a step back and listening and really hearing.
Give us that one more time.
The bougie foo-foo?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a technical term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just everybody jot that down in their notes for later on. All right. Really big question here. Should we invite, and Erik, I'm going to hit you up with this one. Then I'm going to go to Michele. Tony, I'm leaving you out of it initially. You can jump in. Should we invite suppliers, third-party vendors to exercise? Should they participate in exercises?
I would invite ones that are critical. I wouldn't invite every vendor. I'd be very selective. However, those same vendors and possibly a few more, I would want to be invited to their exercises because I want that to be a two-way street. Okay. I want them to see what our expectations are, how we want to run it, what they need from us. That's why they're there. We need to understand what they need from us to be successful, and then vice versa. If they're able to include us in their exercise, it gives me an understanding of what they're up against. Because again, I may be customer number 30. So how do I get what I need, but still have that relationship?
All right, and we got a that's right out of Michele, right out of it. So yeah, it sounds like you agree.
Totally agree. Totally agree. The critical, and they have to have known prior to that they were critical. Now, I don't know, there's an evolution. You got to build the roadmap. number one, have exercises in place that really allow you to get sound in your practices so that you're ready for that vendor when you bring them in for that exercise. But most definitely engage, and it is a two-way street.
Okay, so now I'm going to flip that a little bit. And Tony, maybe I can ask you to comment on this. So I've been at Deloitte for a long time, but I've also worked for service providers, right? Organizations that are like outsourcers or technology providers. What if they haven't built in the resources to do exercises or testing? What if they haven't built that into their contractual fees, their obligations? Like, should they just like put somebody in place to do that? Do they get paid for that? Because as we alluded to, right, margins are shrinking a little bit. Should they just do that out of the kindness of their heart? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's tough. I think, I
stumped him.
I think to Eric's point, I mean, you want to make sure that it's the critical vendors, right? Because if they are critical, then that's something that you would be willing to pay for. I think that goes to some of what we've been talking about in terms of thinking of suppliers as really the heart of your organization in some cases. That's very much the case for a lot of the companies that we work with. So understanding the value that they provide for you and potentially the value that you provide for them, it would be worth it in some cases to make that part of the relationship and to pay for it if needed, if they're that critical. Yeah.
So it's funny, in some respects this has come full circle, because what you're saying is, you just said heart of the organization, crown jewels, right? Focus on the most critical stuff. Secondarily, we've talked about this idea that if they are truly critical, probably both ways, right?
Yeah.
I have heard from many organizations, you're our biggest client, or you're our biggest, we have the largest implementation of whatever. There's a part of you that says, well, if we are the largest implementation of this, if we are truly critical to you, we're going to depend on, we need you to come.
That's right.
Come to the table. And Tony, you alluded to it before. It's about a relationship. Build a relationship with somebody. So.
And I think
Vanessa's on her way.
I know. I see. She's
down.
intimidating. Yeah. So it does. We've talked about strategic, collaborative. We've talked about focusing on the crown jewels, and we've talked about building that relationship. So those are a lot of the big themes that we've discussed today.
And bougie foo-foo.
most important.
On that note, I would say, how about a round of applause for our panelists? Speaking for all of us, we hope it was helpful and beneficial, gave you some ideas, and thank you very much. Vanessa, anything else?
You guys can stay there. Really quickly, a few announcements before you guys head out. I'm just going to stand behind them. It's a group picture here. Thank you so much for attending this panel. If you can complete the session survey in the app, that would be great. Michele will be having a meet and greet book signing out in the foyer, so please meet her out there. While you're over there, the exhibit hall will be open from 11:45 to 1 p.m. Mountain Time for lunch, as well as to see all the exhibit booths and to visit the raffle tickets at the DRJ booth. And breakouts will run today from 1 to 4:45, and we will have a refreshment break at 3:15. And the grand finale is DRJ is having a networking mixer this afternoon on the Sunset Lawn. So please be there from 6 to 8. Drinks, appetizers, and axe throwing. You can't miss it. See y'all soon.